Welcome to the Power Factor Show.
The bandwidth for this episode of the Power Factor Show is brought to you by the Firearms Radio Network. Firearmsradio.tv.
Sponsored by Taylor Freelance, Rainier Ballistics, Hodgson Powders, and JPL Precision.
Hey Power Factor fans, as part of our ongoing series of IDPA rules revisions, the new rule book came out in October of 2013, so it's not really new anymore. It's been around for 10 months. But we've just been kind of plowing through the rules changes, revisions, clarifications. And the one that has probably caused the most consternation, maybe the most discussion, has been the reload rules. And there's multiple elements to that. One of the things is, over the years, IDPA has been around since 1996, and there was the no round dumping rule. And what that was a rule that said you cannot fire extra rounds beyond what's necessary in order to give you a more favorable reloading situation. You have the multiple reloads, but now it's down to two, the slide lock reload and the retention reload. But what there was a tendency to want to do was to run the gun dry so that you, at one position, so that you could reload and be fully stoked when you arrived at the next position. But of course, in order to do so, sometimes you would arrive at a position, you'd say have 7 rounds in the gun, and the targets that were available to you could be neutralized or at least engaged with less than 7 rounds. So there was this sense that people had that, I really want to fire that extra 1 or 2 rounds so that I can do my slide lock reload when I want to. But the rules did not allow that. The ban on round dumping, fear of a failure to do right, was hanging over you. And while I rarely ever saw the violation called on anybody, it was clear that people were violating it. And so I think there'd been, for a number of years, this sense that we need to get rid of this round dumping rule because it was hard to enforce. Some people were reluctant to ever enforce it because they said, I can't read minds. If the guy fires 3 shots at a target that requires only 2 shots, I don't know if he thinks it needs a makeup shot. I don't know if he had a bad sight picture, whatever it is. I don't know why he fired that extra shot. So I'm certainly not going to assume that he fired it in violation of the round dumping rule. So there was just this kind of this conflict. And of course, then the issue was those who did dump a round and did the reload when they wanted to got an advantage on those who said, I'm not going to fire that extra round because it's in violation of the rules. So you had this problem where if one person did it and got the advantage from doing it, if you wanted to win, it wasn't necessarily a value call of, I don't want to cheat. It was just a matter of this guy cheated, and if I'm going to beat him or have a chance of beating him, I've also got to do it. So I think you had this sense of where it was sort of taken out of the realm of being a moral issue of do I violate the rules or not, but it's just sort of like I'm compelled to do it. If somebody else is going to break that rule, I've got to do it as well, and that was justification for doing it, so you just had it going on and on and on. So the new rule book, in the interest of getting rid of round dumping, introduced what was initially termed the flat-footed reload. And you'll see it on forums and whatnot discussing the rule as FFR, for flat-footed reload. And the reason it was called that is because there was, when you heard it being discussed, there was a definite sense that the rule was designed to prevent people from moving while they reloaded. So instead of a running reload or a moving reload, this was going to be the flat-footed reload. You're going to stay in place while you perform the reload. The rule kind of developed I saw like an advanced version of the rules. I don't know if the entire membership saw it or if it just went out to safety officers in July of 2013. And before the final version came out in October, quite a few changes were made in that little kind of grace period between July and October. And when the rule came out, and as it stands today, the flat-footed reload could actually be called the one-footed reload. And you'll also see it called the basketball pivot rule. And the reason they call it that is because if you read the rule, it says, after you've initiated your reload, and initiate the reload is hitting the mag release or pulling the mag from your pouch. Either one is considered initiating. You can lift 1 foot, but once you've lifted that foot, you cannot lift or slide the other foot. So if you imagine you're playing basketball, you see, I don't know who it would be today, down in the low post, but back in my day, it was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Akeem Olajuwon, and those guys would get down in the low post, they'd look for the ball, and they could pivot, lift 1 foot, rotate on the toes of the other foot, but that other foot that was down on the ground had to stay in contact with the ground. Well, that's well and good. You can tell after somebody has initiated the reload, if you see that they've initiated the reload, you can tell if they've lifted 1 foot or if they've lifted both feet. Now the problem with it is the way the safety officer team works today. You've got the chief safety officer or primary safety officer, the primary safety officer who's keeping his eye on the gun and the trigger finger as the primary focus on safety. Now, when you're talking about enforcing the rules for cover, engagement sequence, and the other rules that affect the shooter while they're shooting, you've got the scorekeeper, the SSO, scoring safety officer, who traditionally at our club sometimes was not even a certified safety officer. They were somebody who understood the scoring system, so you'd hand them the clipboard and they were willing to write down the time and the points down. But with the new team format for officiating, if I'm the primary safety officer and I'm watching the gun and the trigger finger, I'm not necessarily watching the shooter's feet. And I'm not watching when does he pull the mag from his belt. I can see if he ejects the magazine from the gun because my focus is on the gun. But if his first move is to draw the mag from the pouch, did he move his foot before? Did he move his foot after? And there's not, and here's the kind of the tipping point of the whole thing. There is not a rule that specifically addresses what you do between the last shot fired and initiating the reload. So while we have this pivot reload, it takes effect. I think it's rule 3.9.4. You can look it up. It takes effect after you've initiated the reload. So if I'm shooting around cover and I'm leaned out like this, as I'm righting myself, if I lift a foot, is that the 1 foot I'm allowed to move according to 3.9.4? Or am I allowed to move another foot? Because 3.9.4 says I can move a foot after I've initiated the reload. So you have this situation where I think there's the people who think they understand the intent of the rule was to not advance from the position where you were when you ran your gun dry before the reload is completed. And that's the 1 foot only crowd. They say after you've run your gun dry, you can only lift 1 foot. You can pivot, but you can only lift 1 foot. Then there's the crowd like me who's actually read the rule book, read the words in the rule book, and see that there's nothing in there that addresses what do you do between the last shot fired before you do your reload and when you initiate the reload. The only guidance we have in the book is the rules that say you cannot advance on the stage. And advance or leave cover. You can't leave cover. You can't advance. There's no definition of leave, so we don't get any guidance there. But the rule for advancing is essentially violating this pivot rule. So my take on it is prior to initiating your reload, as long as you don't advance, you're okay. So that means if lifting 1 foot but not lifting the other is not advancing, I would say I should be able to not advance before I initiate my reload. So say I'm leaned out like this, shooting around cover. My weight is on my right leg as I'm shooting around the right side of cover. Now if I stand up like this, pick up my right foot and put it next to my left foot, have I advanced? No, I'm standing in the same spot. After I initiate my reload, I pick up the other foot and head in the direction that I intend to go when the reload is complete. Now, based on my reading of the rules, as opposed to my understanding of the rules, that should be legal. I can lift one foot without advancing. So if I lift one foot before the reload and lift one foot after the reload has been initiated, I should still be legal in terms of not advancing based on the definitions that are supplied in the rulebook. Now, it's a fairly controversial position. I discussed it with another person who shoots in my area, who I consider to be a fairly savvy shooter, and independently we came to that same conclusion. I ran into him at a safety officer class and I said, hey, what do you think about this flat-footed reload and the definitions of leave, advance, movement? And I said, I don't see anything that prevents you from lifting a foot before you initiate your reload because you haven't violated the rule that covers advancing. And while that rule does not specifically address what you do before the reload, I still consider it to be a form of guidance on what you can do in terms of what is considered movement, what is considered advancing. And my take on it is until you've lifted both feet, you haven't advanced. But if you go, say, to the IDPA forum, there's not a lot of agreement on it, but I find that most of the disagreement is based on that's not what they meant, that's not what they intended. I don't see a whole lot of actual, well, I've read the rule and the rule says this, and that's contrary to what you're claiming. It's just sort of this sense that, boy, they didn't want you to move both feet, so you're not supposed to. But maybe it's my USPSA background, but I want to see that rule that tells me I can't do it before I decide I can't do it. So we're going to go to the range and we're going to do a little demonstration. Again, it's controversial, but if you care about IDPA, if you're an IDPA fan, you want to have a voice in the sport, take a look at it. Take a look at the technique and tell me, read the rules, the 3.9 rules, all of them, 3.9, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, and tell me if it's in violation of the rules. There's going to be a revision of the rule book at the end of the year. I mean, they're going to take another group of clarifications and essentially write new portions of the rule book. And I think this is one of the rules that is going to be taken into consideration for rewriting. So just take a look at it. If you think I'm crazy, send a letter to Joyce Wilson and say, Rick, that guy out in Seattle, he's been smoking that legal weed out there, and he's really off his rocker. Or look at the rule book and say, the rule book says this is allowed, so either write the rule so that it's not allowed, or say, yeah, that's okay. You can lift a foot before the reload, and you can lift another foot after the reload. So just take a look. Now, if we combine not leaving and not moving, since I'm allowed to not move, but pivot during the reload, if I can move, pivot before I initiate the reload, you could have a reload that looks something like this. Take your last shot. You could take a step until I've hit the button or drawn the mag. I have not initiated the reload. So this first step is pre-reload. I can hit the mag release. Now I've initiated my reload. And while I'm doing so, take another half step. So I've essentially moved the full length of this wall without moving. So I think that's going to be, until or unless we get some kind of a clarification to the contrary, that's the way I'm going to be calling it. That as long as I don't advance or move as it's defined in the reloading rules, so I don't leave the cover, and while I'm reloading, I get that one pivot step that I'm allowed so that I'm not moving or advancing, I'm still within the rules. So I've essentially covered the full length of the wall, obviously in slow motion, but without moving and without leaving, because I took my first step before I initiated the reload, took my second half step during the reload, and now by the time I get my slide back into battery, I'll be at the far end of the wall. So that's a technique that I think, if it's not cutting edge, it's the technique that I'm going to use. Trying to get the dance down correctly so that the first move is made before you've initiated the reload, then you get your second step during the reload, and then you arrive at the far end and take your shot. And I think that's just, it's a way around the idea that you're standing flat-footed until the reload is completed. You actually don't have to stay put, because until you leave and move and advance, you can actually take those two half steps. Now, the first time that I was officiating a match where I didn't have an extremely good view of the shooter, it was a situation where I had to kind of follow the shooter into the shooting position, so I didn't really have a good, if you're following the new requirements for the primary safety officer and scoring safety officer, the primary should be kind of out to the side where he can see the gun, he or she can see the gun, and the scorekeeper, the SSO, is in the position to judge the cover. And it was just kind of a weird situation where the shooter went and was kind of crouched around a barrel, so I had kind of followed them into this position, and then as they stepped back towards me, I couldn't really tell if they'd initiated the reload or not. I just saw that they were forward, they came back, then they took another step. So I immediately signaled for a penalty, but then the shooter said, now wait a minute, when I stepped back, I hadn't initiated the reload yet. Not until I positioned myself stepping back, then I initiated the reload, then I stepped out again. And I thought, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. But again, you can see how it illustrates the problem of if the person gets a half a step before they reload so that they don't leave, then they get another half a step as part of their not moving or advancing while they perform the reload. You have to be in a position to see when did they initiate the reload. If they initiate it before they make that initial, if they're in a shooting position like this and they initiate the reload and then step back, now they're stuck. They can't then step out again. They've already used their step just to get themselves back to vertical. Now they are essentially doing a flat-footed reload. I mean, they get their half step is just standing up straight rather than advancing. So if you just be mindful that if you're in a shooting position like this, that you get to move one foot before you initiate the reload and another foot after you've initiated the reload, I think you're not going to fall afoul of the rules that say you can't move or advance or leave cover until you've completed your reload. So thanks for hanging with us for another half hour on a Monday. And if you have any questions or comments, of course, you can find us at powerfactorshow.com. You can send us an email at powerfactorshow@gmail.com, or I'm sure the Facebook thing will appear here magically on the screen. So until next time, we'll see you at the range. Have fun.